At Robert Henley's funeral, the gathered crowd believed they knew the man they had come to honor, a respected philanthropist, a kind presence in the community. His polished reputation and generous deeds were well known, but few had ever questioned what sacrifices lay beneath his quiet kindness. As mourners whispered among themselves, an elderly woman named Hattie DeLay stepped forward, claiming she knew Robert better than anyone present. Her revelation sent a ripple of shock through the crowd. The Robert they had celebrated was not just a charitable man in a tailored suit, but a fighter, a man who once risked everything for justice. Hattie revealed that Robert had been deeply involved in the civil rights movement, sacrificing his career and personal security to stand for equality. The audience listened in stunned silence as she described his struggles, losing his job, living in hardship, and even saving her family from violence. It became clear that Robert's greatest acts of service were not those widely recognized, but those done in secrecy, without seeking acknowledgement. The funeral, once a mere farewell, transformed into a moment of awakening. The mourners now faced a powerful truth. They had only known a fraction of the man Robert Henley truly was. As the funeral service continued, a quiet but commanding presence emerged from the edge of the crowd. An elderly woman dressed in a modest, deep green dress, her silver hair neatly tucked beneath a simple hat. In her hands, she clutched a single red rose, her fingers steady, though the emotion in her eyes told a different story. Few in the crowd recognized her, and even fewer acknowledged her presence. While others exchanged pleasantries and shared memories of Robert Henley, she stood alone, observing, waiting. When the pastor finished his final prayer, the woman stepped forward. The soft crunch of gravel beneath her heels was the only sound as the mourners instinctively parted to let her through. She moved with quiet dignity, placing the rose carefully atop the polished casket, before turning to face the crowd. A hush fell over the cemetery. Then, with a steady voice, she introduced herself. "My name is Hattie DeLay. I doubt many of you know me, but I knew Robert better than anyone here." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, faces turning toward one another in confusion. Who was this woman? How could she claim to have known Robert Henley so intimately? Their surprise was evident, yet Hattie remained unwavering. Her gaze swept over the sea of faces, calm yet resolute. She took a deep breath before continuing, her words filled with unspoken weight. "Before today ends, you will understand why I am here, and you will come to know the Robert Henley most of you never truly knew." The crowd grew silent, sensing that what she was about to reveal would change everything they thought they knew about the man they had gathered to mourn. Hattie DeLay stood before the stunned mourners, her presence commanding yet unassuming. As she began to speak, her voice carried a quiet authority that drew everyone in. "I met Robert 50 years ago," she said, her gaze distant, as though reliving the moment. "Not here, not in this town, but in Montgomery, Alabama, during a time when people like me weren't welcome in places like this." The crowd leaned in slightly, curiosity flickering in their eyes. She went on to reveal a side of Robert Henley that none of them had ever known. He had not always been the polished philanthropist they remembered. In his youth, Robert had been a passionate advocate for justice, a man willing to risk everything for what he believed in. He had been a teacher, but his true devotion lay in the civil rights movement. "That's where we met," Hattie continued, her voice tinged with both pride and pain. "On the steps of a church where we were organizing sit-ins. Robert wasn't afraid to stand beside me, even when it meant losing his job or facing threats." Gasps rippled through the group. This was not the Robert they had known. He had always been generous and kind, but no one had ever spoken of his involvement in such struggles. Hattie let the weight of her words settle before continuing. "We weren't just comrades in the fight for justice," she said, her voice softening. "We became each other's family when the world seemed determined to tear us apart." Robert had been there for her when she lost her sister to the violence of those times, just as she had been there for him when he was ostracized by his own. The crowd listened in stunned silence. The man they had come to honor was no longer just a figure of charity. He was a warrior for change, a man who had given up more than they could have imagined. Hattie DeLay's voice softened, but the conviction in her words remained unshaken. As she looked over the mourners, she continued, "Robert and I weren't just allies in the fight for justice. We were family, not by blood, but by choice." A murmur spread through the crowd, some exchanging uncertain glances, others listening intently. She took a deep breath before pressing on. "He called me his sister, in every way that mattered, even when the world told him he shouldn't. In those days, a white man standing beside a black woman wasn't just frowned upon. It was dangerous. But Robert never hesitated." The weight of her words hung in the air. The mourners had always known Robert Henley as a man of generosity and kindness, but they had never heard of the bond he had shared with this woman. Hattie's hand trembled slightly as she adjusted her hat, her gaze lingering on the polished casket before her. "When I lost my sister to the violence of those times, Robert was the one who stood by me. And when he was cast out of his own circles, abandoned by those who once called him a friend, I was there for him." A heavy silence settled over the cemetery. The picture of Robert Henley that Hattie was painting was not one of a distant benefactor, but of a man who had suffered, sacrificed, and formed unbreakable bonds in the face of adversity. "We shared meals, stories, and tears," she continued. "We lifted each other up when the world tried to bring us down." She turned back to the crowd, her expression both sorrowful and resolute. "He wasn't just a man who gave to others. He was a man who stood beside them, even when it cost him everything." The mourners stood frozen, confronted with a truth they had never considered. The Robert Henley they thought they knew had been far more than a kind-hearted philanthropist. He had been a fighter, a friend, and above all, a man of unshakable loyalty. Hattie DeLay took a steady breath, her hands tightening around the edges of her purse as she continued, her voice unwavering. "Robert Henley didn't just talk about justice. He lived it. And for that, he paid a price none of you ever knew." The crowd, still processing what they had already heard, leaned in, sensing that the story was far from over. "In 1967, Hattie said, Robert lost his job. Not because he was a bad teacher, not because he did anything wrong, but because he marched in Selma." A ripple of shock swept through the mourners. Some shook their heads in disbelief. The Robert Henley they knew had been a man of quiet generosity, not a radical, but Hattie was firm. The school board called it unbecoming conduct, but we all knew what it was: retribution. She let the silence stretch before continuing, her voice thick with emotion. "He packed up what little he had and moved into a small one-bedroom house on the south side of Montgomery. He scraped by, tutoring children when he could, never once turning his back on the fight." The crowd shifted uneasily, struggling to reconcile this image with the man they had known. But Hattie wasn't finished. "When my house was firebombed for hosting meetings, it was Robert who showed up in the middle of the night with his car. He drove me and my nephews to safety without hesitation, knowing full well the risk." She turned to the casket, her voice soft but firm. "That's who Robert was. Not just a man in a tailored suit who gave to charity, but a man who walked through fire for the people he loved." The weight of her words settled over the mourners, their understanding of Robert Henley forever changed. Hattie DeLay stood still for a moment, letting her words settle over the stunned crowd. The mourners, once filled with certainty about the man they had come to honor, now felt the ground shift beneath them. But there was more, something deeper, something even more personal. Taking a slow breath, Hattie reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper, her hands trembling slightly. "This," she said, holding it up, "is a letter Robert wrote to me in 1972. I want to read just one part to you." She unfolded the fragile paper with care, her voice steady but tinged with emotion as she began. "Hattie, you are the sister I chose when life gave me none. We have shared burdens no one should bear, but I would carry them again for you without question. You remind me every day that love is not about blood. It's about who shows up when the world turns its back." Her voice cracked on the last line, and for the first time she allowed herself a brief moment to gather her composure. Around her the crowd was silent. Some looked down in shame, others wiped at their eyes. Robert Henley had never spoken of these sacrifices. He had never asked for sympathy, never sought recognition. He had carried these burdens alone, asking for nothing in return. Hattie folded the letter carefully, pressing it to her chest for a moment, before speaking again. Robert never turned his back on anyone, not even when it cost him everything. And yet, how many of you here knew any of this? How many of you cared enough to ask? The question hung in the air like a heavy fog, pressing on the crowd. The Robert Henley they had celebrated was generous, kind, but the Robert Hattie knew had been something more. He had been a man of quiet, unshakable sacrifice. The crowd stood in stunned silence, Hattie's words still hanging in the air. The Robert Henley they had believed they knew, a man of wealth, status and charity, had been far more than they had ever imagined. But there was still one more truth to be revealed, one that would redefine his legacy forever. Hattie's hands clenched tightly around her purse as she steadied herself. "There's one more truth about Robert," she said, her voice unwavering. "A truth none of you would have guessed, yet one that shaped everything he stood for." The mourners leaned in, their curiosity mingled with hesitation. Then Hattie spoke the words that sent a ripple of shock through the gathering. "Robert had a son," she said. "A son he could never openly claim because of who his mother was." Gasps echoed through the crowd. Faces turned toward one another in disbelief. Robert Henley, a man so deeply respected, a pillar of the community, had kept such a secret. "His son's name is Samuel," Hattie continued, her voice steady, "and he is here today." At that moment, a tall man stepped forward from the back of the crowd. He moved with quiet dignity, his presence commanding, and as he reached the front, the resemblance to Robert was unmistakable. The crowd fell completely silent. Samuel stood beside Hattie, his voice thick with emotion as he finally spoke. "My father couldn't claim me publicly, but he never abandoned me," he said. "He made sure I had an education, that I was taken care of. He wrote to me every week, visited when he could, even if it had to be in secret." Tears welled in Hattie's eyes as she placed a gentle hand on Samuel's shoulder. "Robert's greatest love wasn't in the wealth he gave away. It was in the people he fought for," she said. "And his truest love was in the son he never stopped protecting." A heavy silence settled over the mourners. The truth had been spoken, and Robert Henley's legacy had changed forever. As the weight of Hattie's revelation settled over the mourners, the silence stretched, filled with unspoken emotions, shock, sorrow, and a growing sense of understanding. The Robert Henley they had come to honor was not simply a man of charity, but a man who had lived a life of quiet sacrifice. His generosity had not been born out of privilege, but out of pain, out of a deep understanding of what it meant to struggle, to be cast aside, to lose everything and still choose to give. An older man near the front cleared his throat, his voice breaking the stillness. I never knew," he admitted, his voice laced with regret. "Robert never said a word about any of this." Hattie's gaze softened. "He wasn't the kind of man to seek praise for doing what was right," she said. "But make no mistake, He carried the weight of these sacrifices every single day. A middle-aged woman, her eyes brimming with tears, stepped forward. "I remember when he helped my family," she whispered. "When my father lost his job, Robert made sure we never went hungry. I thought I understood his kindness. But now, it feels so much deeper." Hattie nodded. Robert didn't just give out of convenience. He gave because he understood what it meant to go without. He never wanted anyone to feel the same pain he had endured. The crowd began to stir, memories surfacing. Fragmented moments of Robert's quiet generosity painted a picture they had never fully seen before. A young man near the back, his voice trembling, finally spoke. "It's not fair," he said, clenching his fists. "He deserved to be remembered for everything, not just the parts we wanted to see." Hattie turned to him, her expression kind yet firm. "You're right," she said, "but Robert never cared about credit. He cared about impact, and his greatest legacy isn't in the plaques on the walls or the programs in your hands. It's in the lives he changed. Yours, mine, and Samuel's." The realization settled over the mourners. Robert Henley's legacy was not in his wealth or reputation. It was in the people he had uplifted, the lives he had touched. As the mourners stood in quiet reflection, the weight of Robert Henley's true legacy became clear. He was not just a man of wealth and generosity, but a man who had endured loss, made sacrifices, and chosen to uplift others despite his own struggles. For years they had only seen one side of him, the polished philanthropist, the kind-hearted benefactor. But today they had come to understand the depth of his courage, his suffering, and his love. Hattie DeLay looked out at the crowd, her expression both sorrowful and resolute. "Robert's greatest gift wasn't the money he gave or the charities he supported," she said. "It was the lives he touched, the people he fought for, and the love he gave, even when no one was watching." Samuel stepped forward, his voice firm but filled with emotion. "My father always told me that a person's true measure isn't in what they leave behind in things, but in the people they lift up." The mourners exhaled collectively, their grief now mixed with admiration. Tears fell freely, not just for Robert's passing, but for the realization that they had only known a fraction of the man they had come to honor. His legacy was not in stone, it was in the hearts of those he had changed forever. Robert Henley's story reminds us that true legacy is not built on wealth, status, or public recognition, but on the quiet sacrifices and love we give to others. In life, it is easy to focus on the visible, the awards, the successes, the grand gestures. But often the deepest impact comes from the unseen moments, the kindness extended in hardship, the loyalty upheld despite the cost, and the willingness to stand beside those in need. For many of us in our later years, this message carries special meaning. We may wonder how we will be remembered, what mark we have left on the world. Robert's life teaches us that our greatest legacy is not in possessions or titles, but in the people whose lives we have touched. A word of encouragement, a helping hand, an act of quiet generosity. These are the things that endure. As we reflect on our own journeys, let us choose to leave behind not just memories, but meaning. Let us be present for others, not for recognition, but because it is the right thing to do. In the end, our true measure will be found not in what we had, but in the love we gave.